I always thought owning a ranch would be the quiet, relaxing retirement I deserved. After 25 years of running logistics for a freight company, grinding through every kind of chaos you can imagine, I'd earned it. The ranch was my dream. A private lake, rolling hills, and just enough distance from town to finally hear myself think. I even had this wild idea of turning an old barge into a personal yacht, a goofy but glorious float that could glide across the lake while I sipped sweet tea and watched the sun go down. What I didn't expect was an HOA. That's right. Hidden deep in the property purchase contract was an obscure clause tying my lakeside property into something called the Pine Hollow Lake Environmental Authority, which sounded harmless. Until I met Karen. I didn't even know she existed for the first few months. I was too busy restoring the barn, fixing the dock, and converting an old hay trailer into what I call my ranch yacht. Picture a floating deck with solar lights, lounge chairs, a mini grill, and a Bluetooth speaker system I'd hidden under the railings. It wasn't flashy, but it was mine. And honestly, it brought me more joy than anything had in years. The first time Karen showed up, I was out on the lake with my old Labrador buddy and a couple of cold beers. We were anchored near the West Cove, where the lily pads bloom, and I had just kicked my boots off when I saw this woman stomping down my dock like she owned the place. Bald cap, clipboard, angry face, the holy trinity of HOA commandos. "You can't have that floating structure on this lake," she yelled from the shore, arms waving like she was directing air traffic. I waved back. "Howdy." Her response was to take out her phone and start recording. That was our first encounter. Turns out, Karen was a self-appointed lake access monitor for the Pine Hollow HOA. Her house sat on the opposite end of the lake, in a cul-de-sac development I didn't even realize was connected to mine by some long-forgotten access road. The HOA had somehow claimed stewardship over the lake years ago after a sketchy easement deal with the county, even though my deed clearly showed the water was part of my private parcel. She didn't care. Within a week, I got a letter, then a fine, then another. I tried calling the number listed on the notices, but it always went straight to voicemail. I finally showed up at the HOA office, a rented trailer next to a gas station, and who should be sitting behind the counter but Karen herself. No staff, no board members, just her, running everything like she was queen of the pond. She slapped a stack of paper on the counter. "You violated Section 12B, unauthorized floating structures." I flipped through it. "This is just my dock extension on barrels. Not permanent. It's anchored." "Exactly," she snapped. "You anchored it. That implies permanence. It must be removed immediately or face escalating enforcement." "Enforcement?" I raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" She smirked. "We have the authority to call in county code enforcement and escalate to law enforcement if you don't comply." That was the first time she threatened to call the cops. Over a floating deck, I built myself. On my own lake. I walked out, thought she'd calm down after realizing how ridiculous it was. But oh no, this was just the beginning. Over the next 2 weeks, she began escalating in ways that felt petty at best and targeted at worst. She had some teenage kid sneak onto my land and inspect the shoreline. I caught him taking photos from behind a tree. Another time, I found little HOA violation tags stuck on the post of my dock, laminated like parking tickets, with check boxes. Who laminates warning notices? Then came the straw that broke the camel's back. I was hosting my niece and nephew for the weekend. 2 good kids from out of state. They'd been through a tough year, so I invited them out to the ranch for some fishing, campfires, and real peace. We took the ranch yacht out, let Buddy paddle alongside, grill burgers on the deck, and just enjoyed being far from civilization. We were halfway across the lake when I heard the sirens. At first, I thought it was some nearby farm equipment. Then I saw the flashing lights. 2 sheriff's deputies were waiting at the dock. Karen was pacing behind them like a chihuahua on espresso. I anchored and rowed back with the kids, while Buddy swam ahead. The deputies were polite, but clearly annoyed. We got a report of an illegal vessel operating on private water. One of them said, looking at Karen like this wasn't the first time. "She's trespassing." I said calmly, "This is my property." Karen jumped in. "He's violating community waterway safety codes." That floating hazard doesn't even have a motor. That's because it's not a boat, I replied. It's a floating deck, and the lake is mine. See the deed. One of the deputies raised his eyebrows. Wait, you own this parcel? Right here. I walked him over to a framed document I kept in the mudroom. The survey map and land deed that included the full lake boundary. Karen's face went pale. The deputies examined the document, nodded, and quietly told her back off. I didn't press charges. I wanted to be civil. But that was a mistake. Because instead of backing down, Karen doubled down. She filed a complaint with the county zoning board. She claimed the lake had been a shared ecological preserve maintained by the HOA and demanded a full environmental impact study on my ranch yacht. She even posted a photo of me grilling hot dogs on it to some Facebook group called Save Pine Hollow Lake. The comments were a mess, mostly supportive of me, but the HOA loyalists came out swinging. I tried reasoning again. I sent a formal letter with legal references. Even got a real estate attorney to send a cease and desist. Nothing worked. She just kept citing community standards and dropping off fines that magically increased by $100 every week. That's when I decided to fight fire with fire. I started researching Pine Hollow's HOA charter, their filings with the county, and the original easement agreements. I spent hours at the county records office, flipping through dusty boxes, scanning every hand-scribbled note from the 1980s. What I found was gold. Turns out, the HOA's control of the lake was never officially granted. The easement was provisional, meant only for water testing, and had expired in 2002. Nobody had renewed it. Nobody had filed for new stewardship. The HOA had been operating on assumed authority for over 20 years. Even better, the marina, a dinky little dock with 4 boat slips the HOA rented out for member parties, was built partially on land that extended onto my property line. They'd built part of their operations on my land, without a permit, without ownership, and even better than that, the marina lease was up for county auction, a leftover from some tax dispute years back. Karen didn't know. Nobody did, until I quietly placed a bid, but I'll save that part for later. Right now, I had a decision to make. I could continue taking fines, letters, threats, or I could end this nonsense the Texas way, with receipts. So I invited the entire HOA board to a friendly resolution meeting at my ranch. They didn't show. Karen did, alone, clipboard in hand, smug grin on her face. I assume you're finally complying? She asked. I handed her an envelope. Inside was a copy of the county auction receipt. The marina? I now owned it. Her face collapsed like a souffle in a thunderstorm. You can't do that. I did. Legally. You've been charging people to use my land for years. She stared, speechless. Then I said the magic words. As of today, the Pine Hollow HOA is trespassing on my property. I'll be fencing off the marina. You have 72 hours to remove all equipment. Karen backed away, stunned, and that was just the setup, because what came next? That was a revenge. I woke up the next morning to the sound of a diesel engine pulling up near my dock. For a moment, I thought maybe it was my buddy Charlie coming by to check out the boat again. But when I stepped outside, I found 2 police SUVs idling just outside the ranch gate and an HOA board member, Steve, the one with the pocket-sized Constitution and Napoleon complex, standing with his arms folded like a mall cop on a power trip. This wasn't just neighborly concern. This was the HOA's opening shot. They'd called the cops. I threw on a T-shirt, tossed the dock rope over my shoulder, and walked down the long gravel path from the boathouse to the gate. My heart wasn't racing. I wasn't even mad, honestly. I was more curious than anything. What were they going to say? That my boat offended their HOA values? That disrupted the aquatic feng shui of the lakefront? Steve perked up when he saw me approaching and puffed out his chest like he was preparing for a courtroom cross-examination. There he is, he said to one of the officers. That's the guy. He launched a full-blown yacht into this lake, without HOA approval, violated the easement, broke the quiet hours, didn't even notify the board. The younger of the 2 officers turned to look at me, clearly trying to figure out if this was a legitimate concern or just suburban melodrama. I raised a hand and smiled. Morning, gentlemen. I'm Jake Tanner. This is my ranch. That's my lake. That's my boat. Anything else? The older officer, a broad-shouldered guy with sun-wrinkled skin and aviators that hadn't gone out of style since Top Gun, cleared his throat and said, Mr. Tanner, we got a call about a disturbance involving a large vessel being launched onto a residential lake. We're just here to assess the situation and make sure there's no public safety concern. I nodded. Totally fair. Would you like a tour? I just installed reinforced dock bumpers. You won't believe the craftsmanship on the hull welds. Steve interrupted. This isn't a boat show. You're legally occupying HOA water. That made the older cop raise an eyebrow. HOA water? I gestured toward the property lines. Would you like to see the land deed and water rights from 1983? Or the newer survey from the county I had recertified last year? The lake's boundaries fall entirely within the parcel I purchased. This isn't a shared body. It's mine. Steve began to sputter. That's not what we have on file. The younger officer pulled out his tablet. Mr. Tanner, would you be willing to provide that documentation for us to review? Just to verify? Of course, I said, already pulling out the laminated folder I kept in the boathouse safe just for situations like this. Give me 5 minutes. Back in the boathouse, I handed over notarized documents showing the lake's inclusion within the ranch's original boundaries, including water rights that had been uninterrupted for over 40 years. The younger officer took pictures while the older one skimmed the topography notes and the county engineer's approval. Steve was turning a shade of red that suggested his HOA power trip was running on fumes. We'll document this and close the complaint, the older officer said after a beat. Far as we can tell, Mr. Tanner hasn't broken any laws. And the HOA? I asked, do they get to keep filing these nuisance calls every time I take my boat out? The cop gave me a slight grin. We'll make a note of the incident history. If it becomes harassment, you've got options. As the cops walked back to their SUVs, Steve stayed behind. His expression shifted from frustration to something else. Panic? Resentment? I couldn't quite read it, but as he watched the patrol vehicles drive away, he muttered just loud enough for me to hear. You think you're clever, Tanner, but this isn't over. I smiled. That's what I'm counting on. Over the next 2 days, the petty warfare kicked into high gear. The HOA issued me 3 separate non-compliance notices for infractions that didn't even exist in the bylaws: excessive nautical equipment, unauthorized mechanical buoyancy platform, and the most ridiculous one, marine engine noise pollution. I framed that last one and hung in the galley of the yacht. That Friday, as I prepped for a weekend barbecue with friends, a certified letter arrived from the HOA. They were initiating a formal review of my vessel, citing potential violations of subdivision harmony and ecological integrity. Attached was a request to voluntarily remove all non-residential aquatic vehicles from the lake pending board review. It was signed by the HOA president herself, Deborah Crane. That name brought back a flurry of memories. Deborah had been one of the most notorious residents in the neighborhood when I first moved nearby years ago. She was the kind of person who measured her worth by the number of lawn flamingos she could ban, and the shade of beige she forced homeowners to paint their fences. And now she was back, full throttle, aiming her Suburban artillery straight at me. I drafted a simple response, typed in bold 16-point font. Dear Ms. Crane and HOA Board, as the exclusive legal owner of Tanner Lake, which exists entirely within my private ranch property, your jurisdiction does not extend over the aquatic boundaries, vessels, or dock infrastructure therein. Any further correspondence or enforcement attempts will be directed to my legal counsel. Sincerely, Jake Tanner. I sealed it, had it delivered by courier, and poured myself a glass of scotch. That night, around 8 p.m., I noticed a string of flashlights bobbing near the far end of the lake. Through binoculars, I spotted a group of HOA board members, Steve included, standing on the shore, pointing at the boat with what looked like a measuring tape and some sort of surveying gear. They were trying to prove the boat encroached onto HOA control land. They were desperate. The next morning, I got a text from Charlie. Check HOA's private Facebook. It's popping off. Turns out, Someone had leaked Deborah's new HOA initiative to regulate lakeside activity. The comments exploded with outrage. Didn't even know that lake wasn't ours. So Jake owns a whole lake? That's badass. Why are we spending dues money on fighting him? Wait, are our marina slips even legit? And there it was, the seed of doubt. The HOA's crown jewel, the marina at the far end of the lake, had always operated under the assumption that part of the water lapped into common property. But the new boundary survey I'd shared, it disproved that. Technically, the HOA's beloved marina was partially built into my water. It was game time. After the bogus ticket and HOA citation stunted the lake, I was steaming. There was no legal precedent, no jurisdiction, and certainly no cause to threaten me over the lake I had inherited through 4 generations of my family's blood and grit. That lake had seen my grandfather fish for supper, my father lay the pilings for the first dock, and my mother teach me how to steer a boat before I ever drove a car. The HOA might have drawn imaginary lines on their petty community maps, but I had actual deeds, original surveys, and a hell of a lot more patience than they were banking on. But I didn't want to go full thermonuclear just yet. Not without making them squirm a little first. Sometimes revenge is best served slow-smoked, with a side of legal paperwork and public embarrassment. First, I called to my buddy Travis, a top-tier land use attorney who'd represented ranchers and lake owners all across Texas. He practically laughed when I told him the story. They're trying to restrict access to your privately owned lake? He chuckled. You've got to be kidding me. Nope. Even called the cops when I launched my pontoon. I said, claimed I was violating HOA lakefront decorum and that my boat didn't match their visual standards. Travis paused. Okay, now I want to crush them. We filed a cease and desist against the HOA board, specifically citing trespassing, false reporting, and unauthorized restriction of property usage. We served it to each board member personally, on a weekend, just as they were hosting their smug little Lake Day community event at the HOA clubhouse, which ironically sat illegally close to the waterline per federal floodplain regulations. I watched from across the lake with binoculars as the process server handed over the thick envelope to HOA President Brenda Martin. Her face went from peachy wine-sipping pink to a ghostly shade of ash. I swear I could hear her shriek from the other side of the lake. But I wasn't done. Not even close. You see, there was a private marina that sat just down the bank from my property. It used to be run by a sweet older couple, Fred and Marla, but they closed it a few years ago due to health issues and mounting HOA pressure. I knew they still owned the land, but what the HOA didn't know was that I'd been in talks with Fred and Marla for months about buying it, mainly as a nostalgic tribute to my childhood when I used to rent paddle boats from them for $5. Now, I wanted the marina for something else. Leverage. The marina property included 2 boat slips, a long dock that jutted right into the heart of the lake's eastern side, and, get this, a small strip of road that happened to serve as the only access path to the HOA's exclusive lakefront pavilion. If I bought that land, the HOA's primary lake amenity, the crown jewel of their community marketing, would effectively be landlocked unless they accessed it by water. And who owned the water? Me. So I made the offer. Fred and Marla were thrilled. I overpaid, not because I had to, but because I wanted them to feel good about passing the torch. In one swift closing, I became the legal owner of the marina, the boat slips, and the road leading to the HOA's pride and joy. Just days later, I posted a sign. Private property, no HOA access. Violators will be towed and prosecuted. Let me tell you, it was like throwing a beaver into a beehive. Brenda called me personally, after ignoring my calls for weeks, of course. You can't just block the access road, she stammered. Actually, Brenda, I can. And I did. I replied, sipping my coffee. But that's community property. No, Brenda. The lake isn't community property. Neither is the marina. Neither is the dock. And neither is that access road. Your HOA map is a fantasy. My deeds are real. She was fuming, but the real fireworks didn't start until 2 days later, when the HOA tried to stage a protest. About 20 residents marched toward the access gate, wearing matching T-shirts that read, "Save Our Shoreline." They brought signs, kids. even a golden retriever wearing a little life vest. I calmly walked down from my cabin, holding a copy of the deed in one hand and the cease and desist order in the other. "Folks," I said, voice calm and clear, "this is private property. If you step past this point, you are trespassing." Brenda stepped forward, clutching her smartphone like it was a holy relic. "We're exercising our rights. We pay dues. We deserve access." "That's cute," I said, "but unless you plan to swim from the cul-de-sac, you're going to need my permission." Then I pointed to the drone overhead, capturing the entire scene in 4K. I had a live stream going straight to Facebook and YouTube under the title, "HOA tries to seize private lakefront. Watch them get schooled." Within 2 hours, the stream had over 12,000 views and was climbing fast. They retreated in humiliation. But here's where it got even better. I reopened the marina, but not to the HOA. I made it free and accessible to military families, veterans, first responders, and locals from the surrounding rural counties who had been slowly pushed out by HOA overreach and inflated property taxes. I even set up picnic tables and a fire pit on the shore. Every weekend, the area came alive with laughter, kids fishing, dogs splashing, and families floating around on paddle boats and inner tubes. The HOA, meanwhile, had to explain to their residents why their dues were going up, their lake access was restricted, and why their exclusive shoreline pavilion now sat abandoned behind a chain-lock gate. One resident snuck me an email that Brenda had sent the HOA board. It read, "This man is destroying the structure of our community. He is vindictive, unreasonable, and clearly trying to humiliate us." She wasn't wrong, but I wasn't done yet. The final move would come with a loud splash, one she'd never forget. And it all started with the yacht. The commotion around the HOA clubhouse began before I even stepped off the dock that morning. The yacht, a restored 1950s Chris Craft I named Independence, was docked on the far end of my property, now technically within the HOA's line of sight, though absolutely not within their control. I had maneuvered it from the far end of my lake via a shallow canal that was legally mine, yet that didn't stop Karen from assembling her pitchfork brigade. I was sipping coffee in a captain's chair on the sun deck when they approached. A crowd of no less than 20 HOA board members and concerned residents marched down the slope from the clubhouse to the edge of their border, holding signs, shouting, and demanding to see paperwork. Karen, in true form, had a folder of regulations clutched in one hand and a megaphone in the other. She turned it on and barked like a sheriff who had mistaken herself for a military commander. This vessel is in violation of HOA Code 14.3b. No watercraft exceeding 20 feet may be stored on or near community-accessible lake frontage. I stepped down the gangplank, walked calmly to the edge of my shoreline, and said one word that would light the fuse. "Prove it." Karen fumed. Her left eye twitched. She waved the papers at me through the air like a sword. "It's in the bylaws. You can't have that eyesore so close to shared land. This lake is under community covenant." I smiled, took a long sip of my coffee, and held up a rolled-up document of my own. This is the original plat map and deed. Your HOA's border ends 15 feet that way, past that tree stump. I'm well within my rights. That was the day Karen made her second biggest mistake. She called the cops. Again. I knew the officer by name, Deputy Raymond. We'd worked together on some zoning disputes over the years. When he arrived, his cruiser barely made it past a cluster of luxury golf carts clogging the road. "Karen," he sighed before she even said a word. "What now?" She launched into a rehearsed tirade about maritime hazards, HOA safety, noise disturbances, and property value declines. She claimed my yacht was anchored illegally and creating risk for children. Deputy Raymond raised an eyebrow and asked me flatly, "You have the original deed again?" I handed it to him. He read for about 30 seconds, flipped the page, and handed it back. "Ma'am, unless the HOA has purchased a shoreline, you're out of bounds. This man owns the land and the water he floated it on." Karen turned a shade of red so intense it looked like her lipstick had spread across her entire face. "You're siding with him? This affects the whole community." Raymond was polite, but firm. "This isn't community property. It's his. You don't want to trespass, ma'am. That would be a real legal problem." Then he turned to me and muttered, "You always did have the sharpest pen in land rights, huh?" I nodded. "Thanks, Ray." As he left, Karen stormed away, but I saw her whispering to a man I didn't recognize. Someone in a suit. That caught my attention. The next morning, I got a letter. Not a typical violation this time. It was a formal injunction filed with the county zoning board by the HOA's legal representative. They wanted me to cease and desist all maritime activity on the lake until further notice. The attached justification? Unapproved shoreline construction, safety hazards, and community disruption. But they had one critical weakness. The marina. You see, just across the lake from me sat an aging private marina, previously not part of the HOA, but leased them under a 15-year agreement that was set to expire that very month. The land itself had been listed quietly for sale, but no one in the neighborhood paid attention to county asset transfers. No one except me. I had a lawyer pull the real estate records. The marina, with all its docks, fueling stations, and launching ramps, was owned by a retired couple out of state. They were eager to sell, especially once I offered cash and agreed to preserve the historic boathouse. The transaction took 6 minutes. Once I had ownership, I posted signs around the lake. Private marina under new ownership. Access restricted to members in good standing. All previous HOA leases void as of 12:01 a.m. Then I went further. I hired a private security firm to install retractable dock barriers and a digital gate system for all lakefront access from the marina side. HOA members who previously used those docks for kayaking, paddle boarding, or launching their fancy boats now needed my written permission. The reaction? Catastrophic. Emails exploded. The HOA board issued 3 emergency newsletters in a week. Karen tried to declare the marina's acquisition illegitimate due to community impact. I invited a local news crew to do a story on how small-town power grabs go wrong and gave them a tour of my historic yacht while they filmed the angry crowd protesting outside the gated marina. That story went viral in our county. One quote from Karen sealed her fate. "He may own the land on paper, but we own the spirit of community." That soundbite ran on loop. What Karen didn't realize was a financial time bomb she just triggered. The HOA had spent nearly $600,000 in community funds upgrading the leased marina over the years. Without legal assurance, it would remain under their control. Once my ownership became public, the insurance company for the HOA launched an internal audit. Turns out Karen and her board had signed those contracts without member-wide approval. That was a direct violation of the bylaws. Now, they were facing a member-led vote of no confidence. I sat on my yacht, sipping a fine bourbon as I watched chaos unfold across the water. By the end of the month, Karen was no longer HOA president, and I had one more surprise in store. Because just behind the marina, connected by a thin footpath across a private bridge, was a sliver of land that no one had considered valuable. A useless, overgrown strip between the clubhouse and the lakefront. It had been written off as unbuildable wetland by the county, except that the wetland was only seasonal. And after some surveying and a clever petition, I got it rezoned as private residential utility corridor, which meant I now own the only viable land path connecting the HOA clubhouse to their beloved lake. And I closed it permanently. Karen's face when she realized the clubhouse was now legally landlocked? Priceless. I put up a fence with a sign that said, "Private access. Trespassers will be recorded, fined, and publicly shamed." Then I went inside and started designing the next big project, a lakeside wedding venue on the yacht deck, with full catering services. Permits already in progress. The HOA may have started this war, but I bought the battlefield out from under them. And now, they'd have to ask me if they ever wanted to launch a boat again. And my answer? Depends on the wine. The following week brought a stillness over the neighborhood, a hush that could only be described as institutional shock. People who once huddled in cliques outside the HOA clubhouse now sat in their driveways, sipping coffee in quiet contemplation. No one dared speak of it aloud, but the realization was written on every face. The HOA had been outplayed, utterly, completely, and by the very man they tried to brand as an outsider. My yacht, technically still docked at the newly acquired marina, had become something of a tourist attraction. Kids in the community came by with their bikes, pressing their faces to the chain-link fence. Some even shouted compliments like, "Nice boat, Mr. Randall," while their parents nervously stood at a distance. Occasionally, a few brave souls from the old HOA board would pass by, their eyes avoiding mine, as if hoping invisibility came from shame alone. But there was one person who still hadn't made an appearance: Lorraine. After the last meeting, after I presented the deed and watched her face sink beneath the weight of her own ego, she disappeared. No porch sightings, no dog-walking theatrics, no clipboard checks. Just vanished. I didn't gloat. That wasn't my style. Instead, I set to work transforming the lake into something the community could actually enjoy, not some exclusionary space hoarded by a few HOA elites. No, this was going to be a place for cookouts, kayak rentals, paddle boats, yoga classes, and even movie nights projected on a floating screen. The best part? I funded every inch of it myself. Not because I needed validation, but because my ranch, my lake, and this strange little town deserved better. The first event was a lakeside barbecue, open to all residents, no HOA car required. I had a live band playing country classics, a smoking pit with brisket slow-cooked over pecan wood, and fire pits ready for esmores once the sun dipped. I even hired a local high school marching band to perform for free community service credits. Kids ran barefoot near the shore, while parents clinked cold beers and chatted with neighbors they hadn't spoken to in years. The fences between people, figurative and literal, were coming down, and still no Lorraine, until she appeared. It was about 9 p.m., the firelight flickering across smiling faces. I was helping an elderly man onto one of the paddle boards when I heard the unmistakable click of heels on gravel. I turned around, and there she stood, Lorraine in all her glory but stripped of her armor. No clipboard, no smug expression, just a quiet, almost childlike demeanor. She was wearing a simple cardigan and jeans, not even pearls. I walked toward her slowly, nodding for my staff to give us space. She spoke first. I didn't come make a scene. "I wouldn't expect you to," I replied. She stared at the lake, where the yacht floated gently beneath strings of fairy lights. "You built something beautiful. I didn't think someone like you would care about any of this." I wanted to laugh, but I didn't. Someone like me? I mean, someone who lives outside the HOA. You weren't part of us. That's because you never let me be. She nodded. I was wrong. We were all wrong. I let control become more important than community. I thought boundaries made us safe, but they just made us mean. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was redemptive. I finally said, "There's room for everyone now. Even you." Lorraine blinked, clearly caught off guard. "Even me? I don't believe in permanent enemies. Just temporary fools." I smiled. She smiled too. "You're better at this than I ever was." That night, Lorraine stayed for first community movie night. She even danced to a Garth Brooks song with one of the retirees who used to complain about her the most. And for once, I saw a version of her that wasn't snarling behind HOA rules or squinting over code violations. I saw a woman who, like the rest of us, was just tired of being angry. In the months that followed, the HOA collapsed, not due to scandal or lawsuits, but due to irrelevance. People stopped attending meetings. They stopped paying dues. They simply lived. They came to the lake. They enjoyed their homes. They didn't need permission to be happy anymore. Eventually, the HOA legally dissolved due to inactivity and lack of quorum. I even had the old meeting hall repurposed into a free-use community space, open for tutoring sessions, town potlucks, and yes, bingo nights. As for me, I kept living on my ranch, fishing at dawn, riding horses at dusk, hosting concerts on weekends. And every so often, I'd still take the yacht out, engine humming, slicing through the water as the sun set across the hills. But I never forgot that it all started with one absurd moment. Me, floating a boat on my own lake, and getting the cops called on me. I didn't just prove a point that day. I reshaped the culture of an entire neighborhood. And in the end, it wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming something that mattered even more: freedom.